Good morning, everyone, and welcome to November's Schools Forum. I hope I find you all well today. For anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Alison Coleman. As well as being Chair of Schools Forum, I'm the Chair of Governors at the Federation of Fairfield and Colneys in Felixstowe. So welcome all to the meeting. Just a reminder to keep your cameras off, please, unless you're contributing to the meeting, either through presenting some information or asking a question. And if you do ask a question today, I'd be grateful if you could just say who you are before you ask the question to help everybody on the meeting know who is introducing themselves. So we've had a few apologies today from Chris Chambers, Ros Summerfield, Andrew Robinson, Ruth Coleman and her sub Karen Pringle, Angelo Goducci and his sub Cheryl Singleton, and Emma Thake. So they're the apologies we have had for today's meeting. And I'll just run through who we have present. We have Adrian Orr, Amanda Havers, Andrew Berry, Angela Ransby, Anne-Marie Price, Colin Shaw, Darren Woodward, Daniel Jones, Elle Mayhew, Gordon Jones, Gemma Morgan, Izzy Connell, Jackie Dyer, Julia Granger, Kate Cedar-Nichols, Maria Kemble, Mike Quinton, Ashley Jacobs and Paul Firkin. So thank you all and welcome to today's meeting. So if we now turn to the next item on the agenda, it's the minutes of our meeting from the 5th of October. And if I could please take the minutes for matters arising and accuracy as we go through. So please, if you could shout out if there's anything you want to raise at this point, please, for page 1 and page 2, page 3, page 4, and page 5. Any queries or anything anybody wants to raise about those minutes? Last chance. Okay, thank you. I'll take those as an accurate reflection of our meeting on the 5th of October then. Thank you. Thank you very much. Hello, Rowena. Rowena Mackey, you're also present. Thank you. And Sue Prickett. Sorry, I missed those off the list as I was scrolling down. Apologies. Oh, I might have stopped at P. Hang on, let me go back to the people then. Apologies, I need to click the see more, don't I? Let me follow it off. Okay, so I'll conclude the list. So Councillor Rachel Hood, Robert Lenko, Sally Swan, Sonia Harben, Stephen Dewing, Sue Prickett, Susan Groom, and Teresa Spilling and Wendy James. Apologies that my remembering to scrolling failed me completely this morning, but there we go. We're all here. So we'll now move on to the next item, which is paper B. This is the approval of de-delegated budgets for 24-25. And Sonia, I'll hand over to you to introduce this item. Thank you.
Many thanks, Alison. You're allowed one mistake every schools forum as long as it's not too much of a problem for everybody else on the call. So I think that's your one done. So we'll be keeping a close eye on you today. Good morning, everybody. Just for those of you who've been in schools forums for quite a while, you'll be aware that this paper is only relevant to those representing the maintained school sector, as academies have their own arrangements, usually within their trusts, on how they manage these services. Just as an introduction, by de-delegating the recommended element of an individual school's budget to the local authority, they'll provide the services attached, and then schools will benefit from economies of scale, particularly some of the very sort of, when we do have quite a lot of small rural schools that find it particularly difficult to financially manage. The example we normally give is if a member of the teaching staff is a trade union rep and they had to find cover costs without the support of the maintained school estate, that would be very difficult and quite a large commitment against a very small school's budget. As in previous years, we've got service leads from the local authority who have provided detail as to how this funding is used, and they are on this call if you've got any specific questions. And just as a reminder again, to repeat what Teresa said, the voting is done by phase, so there'll be separate votes on each of the individual services for primary and secondary maintained only. I think that's really it for the introduction. So I'll open it up to any questions and direct them to the specific services on the appropriate representation. If there's any other information that anybody would find useful. Thank you.
Thanks, Sonia. I know a number of us on the call, we have been on Schools Forum for some time, so we're a bit used to this process, and it's very helpful to have the updates from all the service leads. Thanks to those of you who did your updates this year to explain what the funding is used for in your service areas. I'm playing for time to see if anybody wants to put their hand up or put a note in the chat that they would like to come forward with a query. Robert, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to say, Sonia, I thought the paper was extremely detailed and fantastically well written, and the explanations on why, because that wasn't something I was totally familiar with, make it extremely clear. And I thought particularly powerful was the feedback from other schools as to how they appreciate the service. So obviously you can see how I'm going to vote, but I thought you did a great job. So that was all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert.
Well, that's very, very kind, Robert, but I can take absolutely no credit. That was all the services, the annexes. I just do the first bit. So I hope that Adrian and Julia Granger in particular, and Izzy, and I can't remember who did the other one, is it Sally, take your comments on board, and that's very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks everyone. We know how much time goes into putting this together, but it's really helpful to us to really understand fully, although we know what your services do, to really see how this particular tranche of funding really helps support your services. Does anybody else have any questions or any points they would like to raise before we go to the vote? Just give you a moment. Okay. Right, okay, I'm in the hands of Jackie now. So Jackie, could you please launch the primary vote for do you agree the de-delegation of funding back to the LA for SES? So if you could launch that vote, please. Okay, thank you. That one is completed. Adrian, my understanding was there should only have been one vote for primary.
Yes, you're quite right. I think there's possibly some enthusiastic voting there.
Okay.
The scenario is because the majority of forum is made up of academy representatives. In fact, Alison, you are now the only primary representative that can vote for primary, and Robert and Rowena would vote for secondary, as they are the only secondary representatives, remembering that Suffolk is predominantly an academised county. So I would expect there to be one vote for primary and two votes for secondary, either way. Not,
yeah, just to remind you,
hopefully that's helpful clarification.
For paper B, members, it is only maintained representatives who can vote. Other members will be able to vote for papers C and D today, but not for paper B. Okay, so we'll now launch the secondary vote for do you agree de-delegation of funding back to the LA for SES. So it is the two secondary members only who can vote on this paper, please. Okay, thank you very much. So that came back as 100% in favour of that. So for both vote for primary and secondary, that was agreed. So if we now move on to vote 2A, which is the primary maintained rep, to vote on do you agree the de-delegation of funding back to the LA for support to underperforming ethnic groups and bilingual learners. That vote has been concluded and that was agreed. So Jackie, could you please launch the vote for the secondary members to agree on the same topic about support for underperforming ethnic groups and bilingual learners? Could the two secondary reps vote on this, please? Thank you. That vote has come back as agreed by both. So we now move on to vote 3 for primary first. Do you agree the de-delegation of funding back to the LA for trade unions? So if you could launch that, please, Jackie. And that has been agreed for primary. And so could you now please launch that vote for trade unions for the secondary, the 2 secondary reps, please? Thank you. That has been agreed by both of the secondary reps. So we now move on to vote 4, which is for the primary rep. Do you agree the de-delegation of funding back to the LA for school improvement? That has been agreed. And Jackie, if you could now launch the vote for the 2 secondary reps for de-delegation of funding for school improvement. So if the 2 secondary reps could vote on that one now, please. Thank you. And that has been agreed by the secondary reps. So that now concludes all of the voting for paper B. Thank you all very much. That used to be much more complicated than that. There was a lot more of us to vote. So that has now concluded. So we can now move on to paper C, and I'll hand over to Mike for the paper on the schools block funding formula. Morning, Mike.
Morning all. Thanks, Alison. Yes, Alison has said that this paper is based on the schools block funding formula for 24-25, and it just includes a brief update on any changes and a few other bits that I thought would be important just to highlight to Schools Forum. So Forum are being asked to agree the national funding formula again for 24-25, and I think that's quite an easy ask because we've been following it since I think it was introduced in 2018-19. So I think this should be another easy paper to agree to for Forum members. An important bit, point 3, I think, is the bit about local authorities need to be looking to move their funding formula 10% closer to the government's NFF each year. It's thankfully a position that Suffolk are not in because of the foresight and the good planning of Forum members, past and present. And I think that was important just to highlight. And myself, Alison, Adrian and Sonia spoke about that last week. So I think it just means that although the funding for Suffolk we know is not brilliant, and we continue to lobby to get more funding for schools early years and the high needs block, but what it does mean for schools is that funding is quite consistent. So there's no turbulence. School budgets remain fairly sort of consistent year on year. So we think that's a really good thing. And following the NFF has enabled that for our schools in Suffolk. And as I've said, I don't think there are any alternative options. You know, we've followed the NFF for the past 6 years, so we will continue to follow the NFF. There was a bit I just wanted to add in here around the allocations, which were published back in July. Some of you may be aware of this. So the DfE publishes the draft DSG allocations each year in July, and then local authorities use that for this sort of first bit of planning for the next financial year's budgets. So I have put some sort of bullet points in the paper, which hopefully you've already seen. And this was a response or an explanation from the DfE on what happened. So I think in point 7, I've sort of said that I think some academy schools especially may have gone in and used some of this for sort of forward planning. But I think in general terms, and I have spoken to colleagues in Schools Choice, I don't think too many schools did, thankfully, because I know that schools generally wait for the Forum paper now before they start to do their planning, because I've updated the pro forma that I submit to the DfE with all of the new schools block funding allocations and the unit funding and things like that. So I'm hoping it wasn't too much of a problem for our schools here in Suffolk. I know that some local authorities start their planning a little bit earlier, and it tends to be those local authorities that are not on NFF yet. So they have to do a lot more work to try and sort of balance the schools block budgets out. So just thought I'd add that in there just in case anyone sort of did have any questions around that. And as usual, the final allocations are normally published around or just before Christmas. So once they come in with the updated census information, I'll crack on and normally get the APT back to the DfE sort of 20th, 21st of January time. Annex A, just for people on the forum, and you can share it with your primary and secondary members. The unit values are there, so if you want to sort of do some early planning, you can use those unit values in the schools block pro forma, because they will be the ones that we'll be using next year, apart from any differences to ARPU, which I normally use as the balancing number. And I put in there, it's to do with if there's any changes to sort of transfers out of blocks, changes to premises, or the growth allocation and falling roles allocation that we get as part of the schools block. So that may differ to what we actually allocate centrally. Under point 10, there's a few points there just where there's been some updates. So the mainstream school additional grant has gone into the schools block funding formula for this year. And you can see there's a few bits there where you've had some changes. And there's also been some small increases around some of the other factors as well. The other thing just to note, and it doesn't impact on many of our schools, but there is a new formulaic approach to the split sites, which has been introduced by the DfE for 24-25. The other thing which I always point out each year is the minimum per pupil funding levels. So this is where some schools in Suffolk don't quite meet the threshold. So under point 12, you can see the table there, which just shows what those minimum per pupil funding levels are for 24-25. It has dropped considerably over the past few years for Suffolk, which is a good thing. So it means that schools are near enough getting the funding that they should be getting based on the national funding formula, but it's stalled a little bit based on the figures that I've worked on for 24-25 against what we had in 22-23. So you can see that I think there was 40 schools would require sort of topping up, if you like, compared to 41 last year. So it has slowed down a little bit. And the reason it's slowed down, because you can see in table 1 under point 15 that the increase to the schools block funding for 24-25 is 2%, which is nowhere near enough. I know inflation is dropping at the moment, but you know that's definitely not what we want here in Suffolk. And as I said earlier, we do continue to lobby to try and get more money for our schools, high needs and early years. The other point just to mention in this paper, but it was just going to be more predominant in Gemma's paper, is around the 0.5% transfer from the schools block to support the high needs block deficit. So last year we took some money from reserves to help the high needs block recovery. So there wasn't any transfer, but I think there's been a long-term agreement from Forum to transfer that 0.5% each year. So that's in Gemma's paper, and hopefully that's something that we can agree to continue to see the high needs block recover in the long term. So that does work out in the region based on the draft figures of around 2.675 million. And in these figures, that is taken out of that totality of the schools block allocation that I've used for the draft pro forma. So I think I'll leave it there. I can see there is someone with a hand up. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Over to you, Darren. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. Darren Woodward, Primary Academy Representative. I think you just answered it, Mike, right at the very end there. The allocations at the bottom of the paper. Does the ARPU, have you already taken the 0.5% off the ARPU for the transfer?
Yes, I have. Yeah.
That's what I wanted to check in case it was going to go down further. Thank you.
Yeah, so obviously if you would check the pro forma that I've got here against what the actual prescribed unit funding is on the sort of ESFA website, you will see the ARPU is, exactly, it's higher. So the ARPU will always be that sort of balancing adjustment for any transfers out or any other sort of discrepancies that there may be regarding growth, falling roles or the premises factors.
Way to do it.
Yeah, it is. Yeah,
I think
it is. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Mike and Darren. Any other questions or points anybody would like to raise before we go to the vote, please? I think it's fairly clear. We are in a much better position than many other local authorities around the country. I think, Mike, you've underplayed that really. The complexity that a lot of other local authorities are going through in order to try to work out which of their own local funding formula factors they need to adjust in order to shift themselves closer to the national funding formula gives them a very complicated headache at this time of year. So I think the fact that in Suffolk we made the decision right from the very start when the national funding formula was introduced or was going to be introduced, that we would align ourselves with that back then, I think was one of the most astute things we've done. Makes this much more straightforward. I've been around the block long enough to remember when we had over 30 local funding formula factors in Suffolk, and that was quite an amazing juggling act to get that all to align every year. I remember different people lobbying for each of the 30 factors to be given different weightings. That was quite an interesting time. So this now makes, for those on Schools Forum now, your life is much easier. If you're satisfied that we continue to align ourselves with the national funding formula, then we're not talking for hours as we used to about all the different 30 factors. So I can see I've given you the chance. No hands have gone up. So Jackie, could I hand over to you, please, to launch the vote? And this is for all forum voting members, academies and maintained voting members. Could you please now vote whether you agree for Suffolk to continue to follow the national funding formula for the next year's submission, as previously agreed by Schools Forum, to determine the schools' budgets in 24-25. I think there's a couple of people left to vote. Thank you. Everyone is in favour. So thank you very much. That has been passed. So thank you very much. You and your team, Mike, I know with the final figures coming out near Christmas, it's then a bit frantic for you, I know, Christmas and early in the new year to get all the budget packs ready. So just wish you and your team well for that piece of work that you've got coming up. So thank you very much.
No, thanks. And following the NFF, it does make my life a lot easier as well. So thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Mike.
Cheers.
Okay, we now move on to paper D, which is the paper about the SEND funding. And so, Gemma, over to you.
Alison, thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. So obviously you've seen the paper that I've pulled together, and what I've tried to do with the paper is give some background information about where we are with our budgets, what it looks like with our trajectories. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to talk about the whole paper, but there are some additional information that I'd like to add that I think might be useful. The first section of the paper looks at the trajectory work that we undertook with an external strategic partner. And what they've said is, looking at where we are now, that within the next 4 to 5 years, we'll be spending an additional £58 million. And even if we do put in the early intervention work that we're looking at doing, and we've increased our special educational service provision, and we still will be looking at a £54 million increase in spend over the next 4 to 5 years. So I think this just gives a picture of the funding gap that we've got from the central government. It just also shows how the projections on the demand look and how many more places we're going to need over the next 5 years. So the other thing that I wanted to bring to your attention as part of this paper and as part of the vote that I'm going to ask you to do at the end of it is to look at the requests for high needs funding from our mainstream schools. Now, what I did with the paper is I put the data in for summer 21, summer 22 and summer 23, because when I wrote the paper, that was the data that I had to hand. And you can see that the increase has been 43% rise since the last academic year, and a 40% increase over the last 3-year period, which is huge. And as I've said to you all on many occasions, and I say it to the High Needs Working Group, when we set up the high needs funding model that we use, where a child has a band and they keep that band for life, and that band only changes if there may be a transition year, or it will be a change in need. So we expected the requests for new bands to become less and become only at that point where needs change or at transition periods. As you can see from this data, that is not the case. And what I wanted to share with you at the meeting now is that I've got the autumn term data. It's not all completely finalised, but we had 1,126 requests for new bands in the autumn term, and 436 requests for increases. Now, that comes to nearly 1,600 requests, and we've never had that level of requests before. Obviously when we first set up, but never a term since all the bands were given and we moved on to the new system. 1,600 is, we've never been anywhere near that before. We are working our way through the moderation process, and actually that 1,600 has gone down to 1,300 because of those that have been a yes or a no, or that have been not the evidence hasn't been provided, but we are looking at just over 1,000 new bans being requested for the autumn term, and that have gone through moderation and have been agreed. So in total, that gives us another annual cost of £5 million. So this is it's not unpredicted, but it's predicted at a much higher level than we ever expected. So I think that's just something that we need to be aware of, and I will report in more detail at future forum about what the autumn term data looks like. So at the moment we are still going through the moderation process, because there are so many. It is taking much longer than we anticipated. So the other part of the paper that I've included is showing you a breakdown of what our spend is expected to be for this financial year. Now, our budget from the DfE is 88 million, and we're expecting to spend 112 million, which gives us just over 24 million pound deficit by the end of the year. And what I've tried to do is, in paragraph 20, is break down what we're using the money on this year and where those increases are in comparison to last year. So I mean, I can go through each line, but just to make you aware, so specialist education services and therapies, we've increased our investment in early intervention. We've increased our investment by 800,000 into therapies, all therapies, so SALT, OT and physio. We've developed a new education access team who are working more closely with those children who are at risk of permanent exclusion, and also an investment in further investment in our ATS, or our alternative tuition service. One of the lines on the spreadsheet, so the contracted services and additional places and support, has gone down slightly, but that is because those additional places are temporary places. So it's where we've moved those temporary placements into more permanent provision, and therefore that money's just moved to where we're paying out for more top-up funding. So it's places where we've set up in a temporary arrangement where the funding that comes from the DfE has not caught up, so the ESFA have not updated the gag statements, and then once they do, then we move them into a permanent top-up funding position. So that's just why there's a negative on one of those lines, and the rest demonstrates our increasing spend on top-up funding, independent placements, and our bespoke. I mean, they're our biggest spends, and obviously there's details of that within the paper. So we continue to see a demand for our independent placements, and we are seeing an increase in cost for those as well. It isn't just the increase in numbers, it is also a considerable increase in cost. And then we have, and Sonia and I have done some work reporting to our leadership team and also to Cabinet about the fact that the market, the market dictates the costs. We challenge where we can, but we are in a very difficult position when it comes to our independent settings. Okay, so that's just the additions that I wanted to add to the paper, which I'm sure you've all looked at. So I just wondered at this point if there is any questions for me about the paper.
Robert, you've got your hand up. I'll come to you. Thank you.
Just unmute myself so you can actually hear me, otherwise I usually get that wrong. Again, Gemma and your team, I think just an amazing job. I think the funding gap for high needs is obviously exponential and it's potentially catastrophic. I don't know if any of you did see Country File on Sunday, and I think it shows just how bad things are when the programme that deals with cows and sheep and wildflowers had a 20-minute section on special educational needs in Devon. And I was amazed to see that 2 million children now require SEN in England. But it does come to a specific question for Suffolk, really. They were mentioning there that the average time for a special educational plan delivered in 20 weeks nationally is just under 50% now. I just wondered, out of interest, how is Suffolk doing compared with the rest of the country? Can anybody answer that one?
I don't have that information to hand, but my colleagues would have. So we have a data dashboard which looks at all of that information. So can I take that away, Robert, and come back to the whole group on that? Because yes, I know it's something we have been.
Yeah,
Yeah, thank you.
It's not a trick question.
No, it's not. And we have got the data. I just haven't got it to hand.
Devon was like 30%. Average is 49%. I just like to see how we're managing in Suffolk, because I think you just do such a great job.
So yeah,
that was really my question. Thank you,
Robert. So EHCP's at 20 weeks.
Thank
you. Come back to you. Thank you.
Okay, next person with a hand up is Gordon. Come to you now. Thank you.
Gemma, good morning.
Hi, Gordon.
And thank you for that paper. And I'm not quite sure whether I can ask these questions in this bit, but I presume I can, because it's regarding the Excel spreadsheets, etc.
Yes.
First of all, any of my comments are not a criticism. I fully understand the challenges that you face, in that they've only got greater since I was no longer there, sort of thing. But this is a general question. The Excel spreadsheet is signed off by the Director of Children's Services and signed off by the Section 151 officer. Am I right in saying that the accumulated deficit is just lying there? It's not set off against the reserves, because that's allowed to be the
we don't hold the high needs block deficit isn't held against our reserves at the moment, and that is going to be the case until 2026, but we don't know if that is going to change in 2026.
Which is precisely the point I was going to make, because that's a false position, isn't it, as far as the county is concerned. And I know that great efforts are still being made to increase the funding for SEN nationally, but also for Suffolk. But the situation really hasn't changed, despite all the efforts that have been made in the past, and I know I made them, and are continuing to being made today. So, in some respects, the demand is only going to go up, and the figures that you mentioned for the autumn term, the number is passed, but the increase doesn't surprise me one little bit from seeing it from both sides of the fence. So without sort of dismissing what we do at the moment, and the efforts we make, whatever government there is, if we continue to do the same thing, we're going to get the same results. And we need to think perhaps differently of how we can approach this. So it's not so much a question, but just if in 2026 it changes, we're falling off a cliff, but then everybody else is as well. But that's the reality.
You might come in, Sonia. No, I was going to say, I think Sonia might want to come in on this one, because you and I have recently had conversations about this, haven't we?
We have, and hi Gordon, it's lovely to see you. It's exactly as you described, Gordon. I think the other thing though is that whilst the override is in place at the moment, what it does impact on as a council is our cash flow. Because we've obviously got this big deficit, it means that we don't have, our borrowing is compromised, because we have to sort of, so all this kind of thing. So there is an additional cost to us as a council, even though because of statute, because of, in terms of we don't have that money that we would otherwise have, we have to offset it against what cash flow we've got. It just affects that. So it's just something to bear in mind, that there is a cost to the council for this, even at the moment, although it's, in the scheme of things, it's obviously nothing like the 50 million we're projecting at the end of this financial year, and just increasing over the next 4 or 5 years, as you've been able to see. So and I know that Councillor Rachel Hood, who's on the call, is constantly lobbying. We are significantly underfunded on the high needs block, although they are increasing they're reducing the money that is allocated via the historical element. That's happening at quite a slow rate. I think it's, it used to be 33%. I think it's down to 29 or maybe 27% now. But that rate, if you think about the central school services block, which is being reduced at 20% a year for the historical elements, which it just doesn't seem there's a great deal of parity there. But as we know, we're not the only ones. And Gordon, you're absolutely right. If the override doesn't change at 2026, there's a really big problem.
Historical factors have no relevance in current demand. Simple as that.
And particularly that we were such low spenders. That's our problem. That what we were trying to do was keep within our budget, and we're now being, I can't think of the word, but we're now almost demonized for it because the level we get through that historical element is so low. So we were doing our best to keep within our budget, but actually looking back, we'd have been much better off having massive overspend because we would have been funded for that.
Well,
and I remember conversations at Schools Forum back then when we were all congratulating local authority officers for keeping within budget, and it's come back to bite us that we were cautious and careful with our money, and it's a very unfair system that's been built in the way the historic funding is hitting us now. I was sort of reflecting on it first thing this morning, and I was thinking if any of us were asking our school finance teams to meet the demand of pupils today and all the cost increases there have been since then, and we only had the 2017-18 budget to work on, we'd all fall over, wouldn't we? So it's inevitable. Sorry, Stephen, I've kept you waiting a little while. I'll bring you in now. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a very clear paper kind of showing the increase in demand, and there is a big increase in demand, and also agree Suffolk has been significantly underfunded. I think previously it was talked about being about £8 million per annum was the figure I have in my head.
I think you're thinking about the difference in funding between us and Norfolk at one time.
Okay,
if we'd had that year on year, that would have made a big difference. Yeah.
But I suppose my concern is even if we had that, we would still be in a huge deficit this year. And this papering that I can see includes no actions on what we're doing about it other than lobbying. The executive summary page of the spreadsheet, there's a section on mitigations and savings, and it's completely blank. Now, I appreciate we want a change to the funding, but what are we going to do? Because it feels like we're just going to watch it balloon to £112 million deficit, and that will be a huge disaster.
So I think the things that we're doing to mitigate it is we've got the Send Capital programme, which is delivering more provision within the local offer, and what we'd hoped with that is that would mean that we would have less of a reliance on our independent sector. What's happened actually is we've created more places within the local offer which have been filled with the children who need them, and actually the demand has surpassed the number of places that we're created, and therefore we've still needed to use the independent sector. Now we continue with the capital programme, and we have got further investment into it moving forward, and there is a new SLD school opening in the between sort of Ipswich and Lowestoft, hopefully within the next 2 to 3 years. And we continue to work with our providers to see what services we can develop to provide more. We have also seen an increase in our special educational service, so that early intervention, looking at how we can support children earlier within their mainstream settings so that we can help them without them needing specialist support. And also we are part of the Delivering Better Value programme, which is where we were part of I think there's about 50 local authorities that have been part of either that or the safety valve programme, where we've been working with central government about the deficits, what changes we're making and what we need to do in order to improve. Now, Norfolk have been part of the safety valve. Now, everything that they've been given to do, all of their actions they've been given to take to make an improvement, we're already doing. So we are, Stephen, we'll be honest, we are at a point where we're exhausting every avenue, and we need to continue to look at what else we can do to make an improvement on our spend and to reduce that the future overspend. I'm not sure how we can reduce the current deficit, but the future overspend we need to look at. And I know that Ross Somerville, who's the AD, she couldn't be here today, unfortunately, is working closely with Elle Mayhew, who's on the call, who is our new Director of Children's Services, to look at what else we can do in order to mitigate this situation.
Yeah, that's good to hear. I mean, a couple of things I was just going to suggest is, so we get a lot of problems with parents coming in who have been told to ask for EHCPs by their GP and stuff. So actually joining up with health colleagues to identify that. The other thing, the numbers you talked about for the autumn term are terrifying, and I would say are far above national averages. So actually, are there certain areas, there are certain schools, you know, a breakdown into that information? Because
yeah, no, absolutely, and we will do that, but we just need to get through. We haven't got. Yeah. I'll bring the data. It may not even be the January. It just depends when we get to the point where we can analyse the data, because at the moment we're just still moderating all of the cases. Yeah. However, we do have to remember that we're not the same as all local authorities, because other local authorities only give high needs funding to children with EHCPs, whereas in Suffolk we don't. 50% of the children who receive funding in a mainstream school don't have an EHCP. They just require SEND support. So that's another thing. So it's quite difficult to compare us to all other local authorities, because we don't only fund children with EHCPs. And again, that's something we've discussed looking at. But again, what that will mean is an increase in requests for EHCPs, we think. But again, it's part of the work that we're undertaking to see how we can make some efficiencies within the system.
I think those things actually need to be discussed through Schools Forum, because at the moment it feels like we're just told the number, and actually those are really valuable and powerful conversations. I think we need to dive into some of that, and
some of that is done at the High Needs Working Group.
This is
such a big topic. That was why we set up the High Needs Working Group as a subgroup of Schools Forum a few years ago, because we recognised there needed to be a lot of detailed conversation around this that we couldn't make time for to have all of that conversation within the main Schools Forum meeting. But there are elements, and I don't disagree, that would be helpful for us sometimes to bring some of the detail back to Schools Forum to help all members here understand that as well. That might be, Gemma. I don't think we circulate the minutes of the High Needs Working Group to the whole of Schools Forum at the moment, but it might be something that might help all Schools Forum members get a bit more understanding.
We do publish the High Needs, so we can share those with the group. Absolutely, it's not a problem at all. And we're happy. Well, you know, we'd welcome to come and talk to the group as a whole. Like you say, the High Needs Working Group, who are really, they're really supportive and really helpful in everything that we need to do. So, but making it open, opening it up to a wider audience is always welcome, because it's those ideas, and it's working together to see what we can do to make some changes.
But in part, because I was going to mention the Delivering Better Value programme, in theory, that was going to bring some external people in to be able to have a look and say, oh, Suffolk, why don't you try X, Y, and Z? But I believe, Gemma, correct me if I'm wrong, but when they came and they talked to you and they looked at all of the work that we do already, there wasn't really much that they could suggest that you should be doing differently. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. The interventions that they had proposed were things that were already in place. I mean, some of them were in their early stages, so we haven't seen the impact of all of those yet. But but moving forward, we will. The other thing is, from the Delivering Better Value, we were given £1 million grant for additional work, and that is a project to, again, it's around early intervention, it's around our educational psychology team, and that service getting involved and having more provision of that type at an earlier stage. So that's quite early days, and we've got a meeting I think next week to discuss the progress of that with the DBV people. But yeah, we're still early, because in honesty, we struggle to recruit EPs at the moment, and that's a national problem with a lot of recruitment. I know it's not just EPs, it's all therapists and most school staff as well. So that's another barrier that we face, but I won't go into that right now. Thank you, Stephen.
Was there anything else from you? Okay.
No, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Gordon, you've got your hand up again. I'll come back to you.
Yes, can I just come back? I mean, a wider circulation of those minutes of the High Needs Working Group would be most useful, and I for one would probably. and the delivering better value people have really answered the question. Actually, if we're doing all that they're saying for delivering better value, then all we need is more money from the thing.
And unfortunately, their remit wasn't to go back to central government to be able to say we've looked at these local authorities and their practice, and actually the answer is that they ought to be given more money because the need is there. Sadly, that wasn't part of their remit.
Well, we don't need to take note of what their remit actually was. Let's take a note of what their remit should have been. Okay.
Indeed, yes, and use their feedback as more, evidence that we take back to central government, which I'm sure Councillor Hood is doing. But hopefully that's part of the evidence that she has been presenting.
No, I'm sure she is, but it's a long, hard slog.
It is, unfortunately, yes.
Thanks, Gordon.
We all appreciate the difficult position that we're in. I know in the past, and I'll just float it out there, that we've said that the funding given to each of the banding at some point might need to be re-evaluated if the money wasn't there to be able to fund everything. And I know that would be tragic for schools and other settings if the funding per pupil for each of the bandings had to go down, but that is one thing that comes into the radar from time to time, doesn't it, Gemma?
Absolutely, and those on the call today will say that actually what schools need is for those bandings to go up, not to go down. So yeah, it's very difficult, and yeah, we're all in a very difficult situation at the moment.
Has anybody else got any thoughts they'd like to share on the SEN funding before we go to the vote? For those who are not aware, we are limited to 0.5% to go from one block to another. So schools block is only able to contribute up to 0.5%. And as Mike mentioned in presenting his paper, for a number of years, except last year when something slightly different happened, for a number of years now, we have been agreeing to passport the full eligible amount of 0.5% across to the high needs block. So with that as an introduction, I'll now ask Jackie to launch the vote, please. And so the vote is, and this is for all voting forum members, academies and maintained schools. Do you agree to the continuation of the 0.5% contribution to the high needs block deficit recovery from the schools block? If voting members could now indicate now, please. So we have 91% of people who have voted in favour and 8% against. So on that basis, it is agreed. The transfer of the 0.5% will go ahead. And so all of the figures in Mike's paper for schools funding are as in that paper. Thank you very much, Gemma.
No, thank you, Alison, and thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye. So our final paper for the morning is paper E, which is the forward agenda. I don't know whether Sonia or Adrian, you want to make any comment about that for us?
Happy to make a comment, Alison. Forum members that have been on forum for a little while will know there's some standard agenda items here that we have to look at. There's one or two additional things added in. There is, of course, an opportunity for forum members to suggest us adding other items, but we try to keep the agenda crisp and clear. So hopefully that's fairly self-explanatory, and happy to take any questions. Sonia, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add about the forward programme.
No, I think just to say that it's just the timing. So if people are sort of thinking why in the May one that it's only a verbal outturn, it's just that we just don't have time, obviously, with deadlines to sort of do a written report because me and my team are busy closing the year end. So, but we will obviously know, we'll be pretty sure what the position is, and it won't be pretty. But we've just had those discussions. So thank you, Adrian.
I think there's a question from
Amanda.
From Amanda. Yeah, Amanda,
Amanda's
did you want to come in, Amanda?
Hi, Amanda Havers, early years PVI rep. the DfE has issued some information about the funding the new early years entitlements in the last few days, and Christina Lewis has arranged for the Early Years Consultative Forum to meet on the 13th of December to discuss this. I noticed that the early years funding rates are on the agenda for the Schools Forum on the 18th of January. I just wondered whether it would be possible for settings to be made aware of the proposed rates before that Schools Forum, or if necessary, whether Schools Forum members could vote on a proposal via email before then, because it's got such major implications for the sector that I feel it's essential that we give them as much notice and information as soon as we possibly can.
Amanda, thanks for that. It's a really good point to raise, and indeed Christina and I were working yesterday afternoon on a communication that's going out to the sector. I think her plan is to put it out today, because not only is that information really important, but as you will know, this year the Department for Education have treated the whole early years funding slightly differently, so it's not a normal year in the way that they do things. So you should receive something today, but I know you'll probably be attending Christina's Early Years Forum meeting, Early Years Consultative Group meeting, and that'll be a good opportunity to just test if what we're sharing is what the sector needs. But thanks for the question.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you all. Any other points anybody wants to make on the forward agenda? No. Okay, so our next meeting is on the 18th of January. So I look forward to seeing you all then. And if I dare, even though we're not quite in December yet, I'll wish you all a happy Christmas, because I won't see most of you until before then. So thank you all for your contributions to the meeting this morning. Have a good rest of your day. Thanks very much.
Happy Christmas, Alison.
Thank you.
Happy
Thanks,
Christmas,
everybody.
all. Thanks, Alison. Thank you.
Have a good Christmas when it arrives.